I'm Chris Harris, and welcome to another Tech Central video from Bullet Central. Today what we're going to cover is some troubleshooting ideas for Bix'n Andy Triggers. Now we've been in the market for 5 years now with the Bix'n Andy Trigger, so we've got quite a lot out there, and the nice thing that comes with that is we get quite a lot of information coming back from you guys, the customers. And we get obviously a huge amount of positive feedback about our triggers, which is great, so keep that coming. But at the same time, we also get a lot of questions and how-to issues, cleaning issues, maybe a breakage, and so on. And what I want to do in this video is try and address as many of those issues as possible. So this may relate to you, an issue that you've run into, or maybe a friend, and maybe this type of thing can help you out. So what I've done is I've actually broken them up, and I certainly don't believe I have everything here. That is why we've got a comment section below in this video, so please go there. If there's something that you want us to focus on or troubleshoot, let us know, and we'll get into it, and we can we can address that either directly with you, or we can do a follow-up video. So what I've done today is broken my troubleshooting down into cleaning, number one, adjustments to the trigger, a little bit of how to, maybe when installing or changing your trigger, and then some of the damages that we would run into with Bix'n Andy triggers. I would say it's fair that the number one reason for stoppages with a B&A competition trigger would be dirt. Dirt gets into these triggers from dust, from cleaning fluids coming in, maybe from someone trying to improperly clean the trigger, and that will stop the trigger from running. Now we've done videos before on this. So you can certainly click on the link on the screen and go and watch that video as well. But just to cover just generally a guide here. First of all, when you're cleaning, don't use the old method of taking lighter fluid, pouring it through your trigger while your trigger's in the gun, and hoping that that's going to flush things out and fix matters. It will very likely make things worse, because all that fluid going into that trigger is going to create some sort of hydraulic adhesion, and we've seen triggers stop working pretty quickly. Now, saying that, I've also opened up some triggers that are just about flooded on the inside, and for some reason they're still working, which I don't understand. But you've got to understand with a Bix'n Andy trigger, we've reached a new level in terms of the internal mechanisms. The forces are a lot lower, so it's not like some of your other triggers you'll find in the market that have got high reset forces. These things can operate right down now to as low as 1/10 of an ounce and still be safe. I'm not saying you must set your trigger there. Please don't go, necessarily try that out. But that is how well these things work. But with that, certainly you got to understand, comes very different parts and forces within the trigger. So when you have a little bit of fluid or dirt in the trigger, that's going to hold up operation. Now, when you clean a trigger, you must take it out of your rifle, open up the trigger, take all the parts out the trigger, clean the inside of the trigger housing, and the parts within the trigger with brake clean, and then lastly, very important, is dry them out completely. The parts in a Bix'n Andy trigger, in any Bix'n Andy trigger, are designed to work bone dry. Okay, so if anyone tells you, oh no, you can run lighter fluid into it, or a little bit of oil, or a little bit of this, it's not going to work. All right, certainly not going to work to the level that we expect out of an expensive trigger like a Bix'n Andy. Just this week, I had a trigger back in that wasn't working. A person had opened it up, they'd cleaned it out, still had problems with it, sent it back to me. I took it out, looked fairly clean on the inside. I looked using a loop, I looked at the little stainless steel, the steel balls, and sure enough, they had lots of dirt all over them. I cleaned them, put it back in, trigger worked fine. So spend some time when you are cleaning a trigger, and I think you should also do that on a regular basis. Don't just clean when you run into problems. You should have a regimen for cleaning, fairly often, especially if you're a serious shooter. Second category, I think, for maybe popularity of incoming calls would be improper adjustments for the Bix'n Andy Trigger. And the big one there would be creep, SEAR creep, or maybe the trigger's just not functioning at all. And I find most of the time that the SEAR adjustment screw, and in a let's just take a competition trigger, standard competition trigger that's only got 2 adjustments. It's got a pull force adjustment in the trigger shoe, and it has a SEAR adjustment up front. It's this adjustment here, the SEAR adjustment, that causes a lot of the issues, because I've seen them wound all the way in, I've seen them wound all the way out, and it's not often that people actually perfect that adjustment. It's important that when you set the SEAR properly, that you wind you turn the SEAR adjustment screw in until the rifle won't function. So the cocking piece will not be held by the top SEAR of the trigger. And then what you do is you steadily turn the SEAR adjustment screw out counterclockwise, and in small increments, 1/16th, 1/8 of a turn at a time, until finally that cocking piece, that's the part in your firing pin that engages with your top SEAR, until that runs, and can be held by your top SEAR. Once you're in that position, you need to test your rifle, with some vigorous closing of the bolt to ensure that that cocking piece won't fall. And if it does at all, you need to probably just back that SEAR adjustment screw out another, I would say, 45 degrees, okay, which is about 1/8 of a turn, and then you will be fine. And then again, obviously, just test to make sure your SEAR is holding. At that point, your SEAR should be crisp and clean. I will tell you that if you've got any discernible creep within a Bix'n Andy Trigger, there's something wrong. There's an improper SEAR setting, or maybe one of the parts have been damaged on the inside, but this trigger is designed for you to operate with absolutely no creep whatsoever. Now, there's one little issue one needs to look at when setting your SEAR, and that is the matter of cocking on closing. On some rifles, when you close the bolt, you may notice that as you're about to take the bolt handle out of the extraction cam and move it down, there'd be like a little hitch there. And if you sometimes look at your firing pin, you'll see that your firing pin wants to back out just a little bit further as you're closing that bolt. Now, that actually is a problem for a number of reasons. First of all, I think it's unpleasant and it unsettles the rifle when you're locking it. But very importantly, when you're moving that bolt forward, and if you have cocking on closing, the cocking piece is going to engage with that top SEAR before you're in a position to now start closing the bolt. And as a result, what happens is you are putting massive forces on this top SEAR. The trigger is designed to work with, about 10 kilos, 20 odd pounds of force from the firing pin spring on the top SEAR. If you have cocking on closing, what's happening is your cocking piece is ramming into this top SEAR, and it may be 100 odd pounds of force that's hitting this. And what happens is that force is then relayed down through the trigger to your bottom SEAR. And in order for you to make your trigger safe, you have to have a little bit more SEAR engagement. So if you see where we're going, that cocking on closing is actually then forcing you to have an unnecessary amount of SEAR engagement down below. and you may be able to feel that creep. Now the parts in a Bix'n Andy Trigger are so finely machined that even when they do overlap, say, more than what is necessary, you may not actually feel that creep, but it is there. All right, so I would sort of make sure that your rifle is the cocking piece mechanism and the trigger is tuned perfectly so you don't have cocking on closing. In order to do that, in a trigger with a hanger, it's fairly easy. What you can do is you can choose a different hanger or have an adjustable hanger, and you can move that trigger forward so that you avoid the cocking and closing. And otherwise, you could go to a gunsmith and ask him to modify your cocking piece SEAR, because there's a SEAR in the cocking piece and in the trigger. So if you push that back a little bit, the right amount, you will avoid that. And I would strongly suggest you do that, because that can cause issues. Another one is pull force adjustment screw. And I'll say this, we've had this in some recent batches, and I'm not sure if it's because the Loctite, maybe was getting to the bottom of the barrel at the factory and getting a little bit stronger, but it has been in several cases very difficult to adjust this pull force set screw. And so we've had calls in, I've rounded out my set screw. Well, in order to avoid that, first of all, don't be afraid to put force on that screw. Nothing's going to break. And if you've got a good Allen wrench, 1.5 millimeter Allen wrench, say like the one that's come with the trigger, or your own that's nicely ground, just make sure it's fully seated in that set screw, and then try and break it loose. If you're still not comfortable with that, then I would take a T6 Torx wrench. That'll actually grip in even better than a 1.5 millimeter Allen wrench, and you can use that to actually break that set screw free. And once it's broken free, you'll be able to adjust it a lot easier. But that is something that we have run into. It's not on every trigger and it's not on every batch, but if you do have that problem, then just remember to use that little set screw. Another little issue that we've got with pull force adjustment would be choosing the right spring. Now, this is quite important because, for example, on the BR trigger, it comes with 3 springs, a light, a medium, and a heavy. And in our manuals, you can identify those springs through the wire diameter. The issue would come in 2 ways. If one, you have wanted to increase your pull force and you screw that set screw in, the pull force set screw in, too far, and then you start to compress that spring too much and buckle it. Okay, that is not a good situation. So I would check carefully to see how much force you're putting on the spring in order to get to your desired trigger pull force. Use the right spring. Check the manual, see where you want to shoot your trigger, and put the appropriate spring in. The other thing is when you have a spring in and you want to shoot the trigger a lot lighter than that spring would allow. The problem there is that once you back this out and you still don't get to the light enough pull force, you may have a problem that you may have, say, the medium or the heavy spring in. And then what happens is you back the set screw away from the fully extended spring, albeit medium or heavy, and you actually get some slop in the trigger. You don't want that. Okay, so just make sure that you're using the correct spring and you not mashing it into the pocket for the pull force one, and on the other extreme you're not backing it off too much to create too light a pull force for that particular spring. Just remove the spring and then go down one to the next spring. So now I'd like to just touch on a couple of how-to issues. These are popular ones that I just want to deal with. I mean, it's no real big deal. When we supply a bench press trigger or tack sport trigger and it has a safety on it, it will also have a bolt stop lever for a Remington 700 action. So that's the little pressed metal piece on the side of the trigger, depending on whether you ordered a left or right-handed trigger, it'll be on the opposite side to the safety. And you need to remove that if you are not going to use a Remington style action. In an action, say like a Bat or a Defiance or a Stella, a lot of these actions will have their own custom bolt stop in the body of the action. So to remove it, it's pretty simple. In the bench rest trigger, there's a little square nut on the left hand side of the trigger. Just back that off, remove the bolt stop, and put that nut back on. On the tack sport trigger, there's a little E-clip that you can just slide off and remove the bolt stop pretty easily, and that'll fix that issue. But we do get a lot of calls about that, so you know, it's pretty easy to fix, but don't worry about having to remove it. It's designed to do that. One other thing we get on our two-stage target trigger, our two-stage bench rest target trigger, with the one that you can actually put your own custom trigger shoe on, and I've got it here in my hand. People ask, well, how do I change the springs on this? And the trigger shoe bar, it's a 3mm bar in which the trigger shoe will mount, needs to come off first. There are two little securing screws there. They are Torx screws. Make sure you remove the trigger bar shoe mount bar first before you try and take these springs out. You can adjust the forces of these springs through that little bar, but you cannot change them. You cannot remove them, you know, through that bar. So there's that. And then the other thing I would also add here is that people do tend to over tighten the screws when they put the bar back. We've had several in here where they've stripped the underlying internal threads. So just be careful when you put those screws back in. There's no need to over tighten them. Please also don't lose those little screws. They're very expensive. They're about $7 each, believe it or not, and that's what it cost us. So yeah, I just that's one little thing. And then always, again, just make sure that you're using the right spring size for the pull force range that you're looking at. Now there's another very common troubleshooting issue that we run into is the matter of trigger sear heights and compatibility with your action's geometry. And to better understand what I'm talking about here, what we have is when we put a trigger into, say, one of our Remington 700 Bix'n Andy triggers into a Remington compatible action, they are not all necessarily 100% within the specification of the Remington 700 for good reason. Some manufacturers have decided to improve on that Remington 700 standard, and their idea of improvement is geometry that basically fits either, you know, the style of their rifle or the market that they're going into. It's certainly not for us to judge what is right or wrong. But in a Bix'n Andy trigger, in our bench rest model, we have a standard sear height. Our standard default sear is what we call our 3.6 sear, and that has on average a slightly lower sear height than a say, for example, a dual trigger, right, on average. Okay? What is good about these sears is that they are all consistent. Now, when you have two problems with sear heights. The one is if the sear, the top sear in the trigger, this item here, okay, is too low, there's a chance that the cocking piece can ride straight over the top of the top sear, and therefore won't engage, and you won't be able to lock your rifle, and you definitely won't get any rounds off. In order to fix that, two things need to happen. You either got to have a cocking piece that comes down further, it moves further away from the center of the axis of the action, or you would need to have a top sear in your trigger that is high enough to catch, to engage with your, whoops, we're just losing a little ball there, you need a top sear that is high enough to engage with that cocking piece. So what we've done to make it easy for shooters, both in our Remington 700 competition triggers and in our tack sport trigger, is that we now have three levels of SEAR. We have a low, medium, and high, and they're the 3.6, the 3.8, and the 4.0. Our first shipment of tack sport triggers came out with the 4.0 SEAR, and in certain actions that was too high. And what I mean by too high, you can say, well, how can you have too much engagement, you know? Because that means that we've got, you know, more engagement here than maybe is required between the top sear and the cocking piece. The issue comes in when you've got about a 1.5 millimeters or 1/8 of an inch that this top sear can depress in order to allow your cocking piece and your firing pin to travel over the top. Now, if the top sear is too high for that particular action, and I mentioned 3 great actions that I know of, the Bighorn TL3, the Bighorn SR3, and the Surgeon 591 are 3 that I know of. They're very fine actions. However, their cocking piece has got too much engagement for a high sear in a tack sport. So what you need there is to go with either the low or the medium sear. And it's this little bar here that gets changed out, and we can provide you with a sear that is going to work perfectly in your rifle. What we really need to know, and this is important, is the distance between the top of your dowel pins that secure your trigger in your rifle action, the distance between the top of that and the cocking piece where it engages with the top sear and the trigger. Now, this can be a little bit complex, and it's something that a lot of you may not be interested in, but in order for you to get your trigger to function properly, you must have the right sear that is compatible with your action. We believe we are the very first trigger company to provide this on a broad scale for shooters. So, you know, what's nice about this is that you can tell us what your metrics are for that action, the distance between your dowel pins and your cocking piece, and we can prescribe exactly what is needed for that rifle. So bear that in mind. That's a big one that does come in. Just one thing I will tell you how that will, you know, it's one thing, it's easy to notice that, you know, when your cocking piece is just going over the top of your top sear, when you've got enough sear engagement, you know, it's a pretty easy one to work out. The difficult one is when you've got too much, and what may happen is that when you pull the trigger, your firing pin will move forward, but not all the way. It'll sort of move forward and then get jammed up, or it'll move forward and you have a very light strike on your primer. That's another thing to look out for. And then when you unlock your rifle and try and bring the bolt back, it may bind as well. And that does, by the way, happen in some Remington 700 actions as well. Not all, but some. So the Remington 700 cocking piece is not as far away from the center line as, say, a Bighorn TL3 and a Surgeon, but, you know, it's certainly out there, and in some of them you can run into that. So I think that's one, it's a very important one to be aware of. Don't worry about it, just call us, chat to us, tell us about your action, the metrics, and we'll get you fixed up with the right sear. Last, what I've got here is damage to triggers. So we do get triggers in where they have been damaged, and the 2 most common are one where we've had blown primers. It's fairly easy for us to see, you know, whether a primer has been blown and the forces have come back, you know, down through the firing pin, being blown back, hits the top sear of the trigger, and then it can, not in all cases, it can destroy some of the parts down within the trigger mechanism. The parts that generally get hammered the hardest are either this top sear, which can crack in this region here. There's a huge amount of force that's coming back, and then the other thing is the retainer bar, the bar that holds the ball bearings. Hard to believe, but those have actually cracked as well. And it's funny, you can take one of those things and you can put it in a vise and hit it with a hammer, and you're not going to break it. But yet, I can never get over it. The force of a blown primer driving a firing pin back can destroy the insides of triggers. The other one would be the bottom sear, where it connects to the aluminum trigger shoe. That can snap off there, and that happens in almost every case where the rifle has been dropped. So maybe there's, someone's taken the trigger guard off their rifle, and they've dropped the rifle. Maybe it's out of the stock, and it lands right on the trigger shoe. That will certainly bend the trigger shoe and or bust the bottom sear within the trigger. So I think what we've done, we've covered a good amount of troubleshooting tips here. I'm sure that there have been some others out there, and if you do get to watch this video, please send us a comment or send us an email. We would love to use this information from you and try and provide some information back to our shooters. Thank you very much for watching. Hope this video helps you, and if it doesn't, maybe a friend, share it with a friend. Subscribe to our videos. I think that'll help. You'll get a constant feed. Give us a like. That also helps. And we look forward to seeing you soon. And most important, thanks for being a Bullet Central customer.